Hello, friends. My name is Will Rogers, and I'm going to tell you things you didn't know about the Civil War. The categories of these things are explained in this diagram here. Most of these facts are quite specific, and although they have little relevance to much else, I hope you'll find them interesting as I have. Hopefully, by learning these rather random facts, one will have a better grasp of the different events that happened during the Civil War and how they affected the different individuals. So without further ado, I present to you
Starting off with music, it was estimated that on both sides, North and South, about 50% of all armies had at least a band of sling drums, cornets, and euphoniums. In the Union, it was estimated that the War Department spent about $4 million a year on bands, and there was a ratio of about one musician to every 40 soldiers. The traditional role of these regimental bands was to inspire courage and spirit to all the soldiers of the band. These bands were widely recognized enough that Robert E. Lee himself said, "I do not see how we can have an army without music." There are other recorded cases of, during the battles of Gettysburg, a band of North Carolina played so loudly during the second day fighting at Gettysburg as to draw fire away from the Federal artillery. Another common folklore involves a young cornetist named Johnny, who, before the fall of Atlanta, would perform concerts every evening in between the front lines of the Federals and the Confederates. This happened often enough that the Federal pickets actually ended up requesting this man Johnny to play for them. Whenever Johnny would play, there weren't any bullets in the air. However, as soon as he stopped playing and got away, the firing would be resumed. Moving on to weaponry, the American Civil War was commonly called the last of the ancient wars and the first of the modern wars. This is largely due to the fact that technological advances in weaponry were increasing steadily throughout the war, including new weaponry like the first metallic rifle and pistols, and repeating rifles, as well as ironclad ships and many other inventions. Though these technological advances were increasing, many of the guns were still inefficient. It has been said that firing on both sides was so inaccurate that soldiers estimated it could take a man's weight in lead to kill a single enemy in battle. As well, a Federal expert said that each Confederate who was shot required 240 pounds of powder and 900 pounds of lead. The Civil War was one of the first new wars to include mortar in their weaponry, and during the night, the lighted fuses of the shells were easily observed and the path of the shell could be traced during flight. In most cases, battles at night occurred while there were many different mortars being fired off at the same time. These mortars would be the only thing that would be able to be seen during the night gambits. There was even such a mortar nicknamed the Dictator, which was a heavy artillery unit that was reinforced on a railroad car to accommodate its weight of about 17,000 pounds. Despite the common assumption that the Confederates wore gray and the Federalists wore blue, the uniforms of the armies were incredibly varied. At the time the war opened, the Federal troops were often clad in standard gray. The 3rd New York, the 1st in Vermont, and almost all Indian troops wore gray with black facings, just as Confederate troops did from Georgia. The 1st Iowa dressed up like troops from Louisiana, and Maine, Kansas, and Nebraska also wore gray. A New Jersey battalion of cavalry wore blue and yellow, and were known as the Butterflies. A Polish regiment from New York wore traditional native caps, square and blazing in red and white. As well as uniforms, the Confederate flag was greatly varied depending on where one went. At first, the Confederate Congress asked the public for flag designs, They received a bewildering variety of different designs. However, even when the Confederate flag was universalized, the Bonnie Blue flag was the first banner of secession and flew in Montgomery, Alabama. Also, flags flown in Texas, composed of a white star centered in a rectangular field of dark blue. Although Ulysses S. Grant was an famed war general of the Union, many people who knew him personally, including Abraham Lincoln, thought of him as a crude and vile drunk. Because of this, Grant was charged on many different cases for a number of different kinds of crimes. Many people even charged Grant with being an anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic slave owner who held personal grudges against some who had bested him in his civilian life and took revenge on him in the army. Despite all of the rumors circling around Grant, he had a numerous amount of trust from his soldiers. One private quoted, "His soldiers believe in him. I have never heard of a single soldier speak in doubt of Grant." Some interesting facts about Lieutenant General Thomas J. Jackson, otherwise known as Stonewall Jackson, who was one of the most gifted field commanders in American history, are that many believed him to be a hypochondriac, or one with great phobias and anxieties, despite the fact that he was nicknamed Stonewall Jackson. Jackson constantly thought himself out of balance, and even under fire in battle was given to raise one arm and allowing the blood flow to flow down his body and establish an equilibrium. Many people noted that he had a very strange diet, composing mainly of raspberries, bread, and milk. Jackson was only comfortable when in an upright position with his organs held naturally, one on top of another. For this reason, he had no chairs in his study at Lexington, Virginia. Ulysses S. Grant himself recalled that Jackson was a fanatic whose delusions took strange forms. Hypochondria fancies that an evil spirit has taken possession of him. Though most of the people around him during the war saw him to be a tough, unrelenting general, acclaimed General Robert E. Lee did have a more human side to him than most people know. For a long time during the war, Lee owned a pet hen which he would allow into his tent every day. This hen often ended up laying eggs under his cot. Even under pressure and stress of war, Lee was able to find time for recreational entertainment such as chess with his aide, Charles Marshall. They managed to use a slab of pine as a chessboard, which they used a knife to carve squares into. Lee was also known for displaying his character by holding his temper, even above many cases of disobedient subordinates. Now for some funny and interesting stories and other little-known things about the Civil War. The Civil War had many names based on perspective and region. Some of the many names for the war included the War for Constitutional Liberty, the War for States' Rights, the War of the 60s, the War for Abolition, the Brothers' War, and many others. A young Confederate officer, Captain S. Isidore Keyett, was fatally shot on the same horse of which his 3 other older brothers were killed. He willed the horse to his nephew as he died. Although some Mexican companies of the Confederate armies gained a reputation for unreliability, Private Juan Irva was not of this type. In one Western act, he staged a one-man charge into a group of 40 Union troops and forced them all to flee. The town of Winchester, Virginia changed hands 76 times during the war as the armies battled up and down Shenandoah Valley. There was actually another Abraham Lincoln fighting during the Civil War. A private in the Confederate Army named Abraham Lincoln, though he was reported to have deserted the army in 1864. The war's 2 most famous and bloody battles, Gettysburg and Antietam, were fought over small trifles. Gettysburg because a group of soldiers needed to go to Pennsylvania to get shoes, and Antietam because a Confederate officer carelessly dropped vital battle orders that a Federal soldier happened to find. Some of the deeper Southern generals were reported to have bad grammar. General Nathan Bedford Forrest was reported to have told his soldiers to get thou fustest with thou mostest. Forrest also had a letter of request on business deal returned by the trader in Memphis, replying that he did not understand them. About 2 million federal soldiers were 21 or under. More than 1 million were 18 and under. About 800,000 were 17 and under. About 200,000 were 16 and under. And about 100,000 federal soldiers were 15 or under. And there were even records of about 300 soldiers who were 13 years or under. However, most of these were fifers or drummers. Major Wilmer McLean was able to say that the war began in his front yard and ended in his parlor. He owned a plantation along Bull Run near where the Battle of Manassas was fought. After this battle, desiring peace for his family, he moved to the somewhat isolated Appomattox, Virginia, to a courthouse there existed. That very courthouse was the spot where Grant and Lee sat down to discuss their terms of surrender.